All right, folks, get ready because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into some seriously heavy philosophical waters. We're talking divine freedom, a concept that's, well, let's just say it's puzzled thinkers for
Oh
centuries.
yeah, this one is a biggie. It really gets right to the core of like, what do we even mean when we talk about God, free will, that whole deal?
And the source material you sent, that excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it really lays out all the arguments. We start with that classic image of God, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, the whole nine yards. But then, doesn't that kind of, I don't know, limit his freedom in a way? If he's already perfect, can he really choose to do anything?
Yeah, that's the paradox, right? Like if you're always going to make the absolute best choice in every situation, is it even really a choice at all?
That's exactly it. And the article jumps right into it, throws us in the ring with, Leibniz and Clarke,
Yeah.
these two philosophical heavyweights who duked it out on this very topic.
Their correspondence, it's like Philosophy 101 for a reason, really gets to the core of what they disagreed on. So you've got Leibniz coming from this compatibilist perspective. Basically, he thought you could have freedom even if everything is kind of predetermined.
Hmm.
Then you've got Clarke, total libertarian, right? He was adamant that true freedom means you got to have the ability to have chosen differently.
So wait, Leibniz is saying even if God's actions are like locked in somehow, he's still free. I'm not sure I'm following that.
Well, it all comes down to his principle of sufficient reason. Philosophers, they call it PSR for short. Basically, it states that everything happens for a reason, right? That nothing just happens randomly, no, just because. So for God, this means there's always a best option, and his perfect nature would always, always push him toward it.
So even if he could theoretically do something else, he wouldn't. It wouldn't be the best move. It almost sounds less like freedom and more like he's, on autopilot or something.
Yeah, and Clarke, he uses this great analogy to really hit that point home. Imagine like a perfectly balanced scale. It's not going to tip unless you put something on one side, right? Leibniz is saying God's choices, they work like that scale. There's always a heavier reason, something that tips the scales towards the best option.
Okay, the analogy makes sense, but I'm not sure I see how that disproves Leibniz's point. I mean, couldn't he say that even with the scale, God is still the one ultimately choosing which side is heavier?
That's where Clarke gets you. See, his counter is that if God chooses like a balance scale, responding to weight, it's not really, agency, is it? It's just a reaction. He's not actively choosing. He's just responding to whatever's heaviest. I mean, that doesn't sound much like the kind of freedom we usually think about with God, does it?
That's a good point. Like, I might be way more likely to, I don't know, pick pizza over salad if I'm totally starving. But I could technically still choose the salad. But if God can only choose the best option, then it's not much of a choice, is it?
That's it. And that's where Clarke's idea of like libertarian free will comes in. He's saying true freedom isn't just, doing whatever you want or whatever makes sense at the time. It's about having the power to choose otherwise, even if you never would.
So even if God always, always picks the good option, it's the fact that he could have chosen otherwise that makes him truly free, according to Clarke. I'm trying to get my head around that.
Think of it like this. Like, imagine a saint in heaven, right? They're so filled with, like, goodness and light now. Would they even be able to sin at that point? Or would their very nature now just, like, totally repel anything evil?
I see what you mean. It's like saying a perfect circle can't just, like, suddenly decide to have corners, right? But hold on, if God literally can't choose evil, how can we really thank him for choosing good? It's not like he really had another option.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where Leibniz tries to, like, wriggle out of this corner a bit. He introduces this distinction between, get this, absolute necessity and moral necessity.
Okay, now you're just using big words to confuse me. What does that even mean?
So absolute necessity, that means something cannot be any other way. Like a square must have four sides. There's no other possibility. But moral necessity, that means something should be a certain way because it's, the good or the right thing to do, but it could theoretically be otherwise.
So Leibniz is saying God is morally compelled to create the best world, but he could, like, hypothetically, choose a less than perfect one. That's what he's getting at.
He is, but it gets a bit messy, because of how we think about God's nature. Us humans, even when we're trying to be good, we can always choose to do something bad, right?
Yeah.
Our goodness isn't like inherent to our being, but God is goodness. It's literally part of his essence.
So you're saying God can't be anything other than good, even if he wanted to. That's kind of a tough one to grasp.
It is, and it brings us right back to where we started, doesn't it? If God can't choose evil, how can we really say he chooses good freely? It's almost like his actions are predetermined by, well, by his very nature, which, if you remember, is exactly what Clarke was arguing against.
This is making my head spin. So are we saying God's goodness is somehow, I don't know, less meaningful because he literally can't be anything else?
Mm.
I don't really like where this is going.
It's definitely one of those thorny issues that have kept philosophers arguing for ages. But before we all spiral into an existential crisis, let's look at another angle that the Stanford article brings up. What if, and this is a big what if God created his own nature? Does that change things?
Wait, hold on. God creating his own nature. Now that's just a total mind bender. How can he be responsible for his own nature when his nature is, well, to be God?
It's a head scratcher for sure.
Yeah.
But the philosopher Thomas Morris, he tries to break this down. He suggests that God is causally responsible for his own nature, but without actually causing his own existence. It's subtle, but it's important.
Okay, I think I'm following. It's like we might, I don't know, shape our personalities over time, but we don't get to choose to be human in the first place, right? So could God have had some say in his godness, so to speak?
That's the general idea. And there's always but with these things, even with this radical idea, we hit another philosophical snag.
Oh no, what is it this time?
Morris ultimately argues that God's creation of reality was, get this, necessary and eternal. So even if he shaped his own nature, he didn't have a choice about it. It was just always part of the equation.
Ugh. So we're still stuck. Even if he made his own nature, he couldn't have made it any other way. We're going in circles here.
Kind of feels that way sometimes, doesn't it? But that's what philosophy often is, you know? Exploring these circular paths, seeing if there's a way to, like, break out. And the Stanford piece, it gives us a few more tools for our little philosophical escape room. So let's see where we go next.
Welcome back to our deep dive into divine freedom. We are still wading through some pretty deep philosophical waters here, trying to figure out how God's perfection fits with this idea that he could genuinely have, freedom of choice.
Yeah, tell me about it. Last time we kind of ended on this idea that maybe God created his own nature, but even that didn't really clear things up in terms of whether he had, any real choices.
Right, because even if we say he, made himself, it still seems like he didn't really have any options in how he did that.
Hmm.
So where do we go from there? Well, the Stanford article brings up this other interesting thinker, Robert Adams, and he throws a real curveball into the mix. He basically says, what if God doesn't have to create the best possible world after all? Wait, are we saying God might have actually, chosen a world that's, I don't know, not as good as it could be? That seems, I don't know, not very godlike, does it?
I know it might seem that way at first, but Adam's argument is a little more subtle than that. He's not saying God would purposely choose a, bad world, but maybe his goal wasn't necessarily to create the absolute best possible world, maybe he was aiming for something else entirely.
Okay, now I'm curious. What's this other goal that Adams is talking about?
Well, he suggests that maybe God wasn't solely focused on, I don't know, maximizing happiness on this huge scale or achieving some ultimate level of perfection. Instead, what if he was more concerned with making sure that each individual being in his creation has, the best possible life they could have given their circumstances?
So it's less about the big picture and more about creating the best possible experience for each individual creature. That's definitely an interesting way to think about it.
It is. And it really shifts our focus. We move away from this abstract idea of the best possible world and we start thinking about something more concrete, more relatable, individual flourishing.
It makes me think about all the pressure we put on ourselves these days to be the best, especially in a world that's, obsessed with optimization and achievement and all that. Maybe God isn't bound by that same pressure. Maybe he's more interested in creating a world where everyone can just thrive in their own unique way, even if it's not perfect in some grand sense.
That's a great connection. And Adams actually uses a really great analogy to illustrate this point. Imagine parents who could, I don't know, genetically engineer their kids to be, superhuman, smarter, stronger, healthier than anyone else.
Yeah.
But they choose to have, normal children instead.
Because they value something more than just maximizing their kids' potential, right? Maybe they realize that there's more to life than just being the best.
Exactly. They might believe that, true happiness comes from embracing our imperfections, from facing challenges, and from forging our own paths, right? And maybe God, as the ultimate parent, shares that same perspective when he's creating the world.
It's a really thought-provoking idea. It makes you wonder, Maybe our obsession with being perfect is actually preventing us from experiencing the, I don't know, the richness and complexity of life as it is.
It's a question worth thinking about for sure. But as with any philosophical argument, there are always some counterpoints to consider.
Oh, right, of course.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the flaws in Adams's thinking here?
Well, remember how we talked about the difference between, like, God and us, human parents? Parents, we work within an existing framework. We can't just change the basic rules of what it means to be human. But God, he sets the entire framework, right? He's not just choosing between, I don't know, different flavors of ice cream. He's inventing the whole concept of ice cream.
That's true.
Yeah.
So if he has that kind of power, that level of control, would he really choose to create a world that's anything less than, absolutely the best?
That's a really key question, and it kind of highlights a potential weakness in Adam's argument, I think. He's so focused on refuting this idea that God is obligated to create the best world that he doesn't really fully address what God might choose if he wasn't bound by that obligation.
So are we back to that same problem again? If God isn't, like, compelled to create the best world, could he intentionally choose to create suffering? Could he create a world that's, I don't know, deliberately worse for the beings that live in it? That's getting into some pretty dark territory.
It is, yeah. And while Adams doesn't really address that specific issue directly, his main argument kind of hinges on this idea that God doesn't, like, wrong the creatures in a lesser world because, they're still having the best possible lives they could have in that specific context.
Okay, but what if God is choosing between, like, a world where everyone's happy and fulfilled and a world where everyone just suffers needlessly? Could he really choose the second one and still be considered perfectly good? Something about that just doesn't sit right with me.
It's tough to swallow, that's for sure. And I think that's where Adams's argument maybe starts to break down a bit. He seems to be saying that God's choice doesn't make a world inherently good or bad. It's more about whether it's the best possible world given certain limitations or, constraints.
So we're back to this idea of best possible again, but with a bit of a twist.
Exactly. But it still leaves us with this, I don't know, uneasy feeling that maybe God is choosing between, like, bad options rather than actively creating something truly good.
So where does that leave us? Are we at a dead end here? Are we forced to conclude that God has to create the best possible world simply because any other choice would be, well, morally wrong?
Well, before we give up and throw in the philosophical towel, there's one crucial point we haven't really talked about yet. What if this entire debate is based on, like, a faulty premise? What if there isn't actually a single best possible world in the first place?
Oh, yeah. We've just been assuming this whole time that there's some kind of, like, ultimate best out there, like some cosmic gold medal for world creation. But what if that's just not the case at all?
Exactly. The Stanford article hints at some alternative possibilities, like maybe for any given world, there's always a better one, meaning there's no final, ultimate best world to aim for. It's like an endless ladder, always another rung to climb.
That's a pretty wild concept. It's like saying there's no perfect circle, only circles that get closer and closer to perfect but can never actually get there.
Or maybe there are actually multiple worlds that are equally good, but just in different ways. One world might have more overall happiness, while another might have more individual freedom. And there's no objective way to say which one is better. It's like comparing apples and oranges, both delicious, but in different ways.
I like that analogy. So it's not about finding the best world, but about recognizing that there might be many equally good worlds, each with its own, like, unique strengths and weaknesses.
Precisely. And that opens up a whole new way of thinking about God's freedom, doesn't it? If there isn't one right answer, he has so much more room to express his, I don't know, his creativity, to choose a world that reflects his own unique values and preferences.
But hold on, if there's no objective standard of what's best, how can we even begin to understand God's choices? It's like trying to understand a language we don't even know the alphabet for.
That's the challenge, isn't it? It pushes us beyond these simple categories of, good and bad, best and worst. It forces us to grapple with the possibility that God's choices might be guided by, I don't know, values and principles that are just beyond our human comprehension.
So we're left with a sense of, like, awe and mystery, realizing that we might never fully grasp the reasons behind God's creative decisions.
Maybe, yeah. But maybe that's part of what makes it all so, I don't know, so beautiful, so fascinating. It's a reminder that we don't have all the answers, that there's always more to learn and explore.
I guess sometimes the journey really is more important than the destination, especially when it comes to these huge philosophical questions. But speaking of the journey, where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like there's still so much more to unpack.
You're right, there is. And the Stanford piece actually gives us one more really important angle to consider. One that takes us back to, our original philosophical sparring partners, Leibniz and Clarke. Their fundamental disagreement about what freedom even means could be the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of divine freedom. So let's dive back into their debate and see what other insights we can uncover.
Well, we're back. And man, have we been on a wild ride, right? Trying to figure out if a perfect God can actually have, genuine free will. This is a lot tougher than I thought going in.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's a question that's been like a real head scratcher for some of the most brilliant minds in history. And picking up from where we left off last time, even the idea that God might not have to create the best possible world, it still doesn't quite solve the whole free will dilemma.
Right. It still feels like we keep running into this wall. Like, if God is perfect, doesn't that mean his actions are, I don't know, sort of predetermined in a way? Like, he's always going to pick what's good, even if he technically could choose something else.
You got it. And that brings us right back to the core of that whole debate between Leibniz and Clarke, which the Stanford article really digs into. They had these like totally different ideas about what freedom even means, and that really colors their whole approach to divine freedom.
Okay, remind me again, what was the big difference between their views?
So Leibniz, he was all about compatibilism. He believed that freedom and determinism, they weren't mutually exclusive. So even if you say God's actions are in some way predetermined because he's always going to go for that best possible option, he's still free because he's acting in accordance with his nature.
So it's kind of like he's free to do what he's, I don't know, programmed to do. I'm not sure that's the kind of freedom I'd be too thrilled about.
And that's basically Clarke's argument in a nutshell. He was a hardcore libertarian.
Yeah.
That means he thought true freedom absolutely requires the ability to choose differently, even if you always pick the good option. He was adamant that if God couldn't, like, logically choose evil, then his choice to do good, well, wasn't really a real choice, was it?
It's that same wall we keep hitting, isn't it? If God can't possibly be anything but good, can we really say he's choosing good freely? It feels like that choice is just like baked into his very being.
And that's the big tension, right? See, Leibniz, he finds God's freedom in that perfect alignment with his perfect nature. He's free because he's acting in a way that completely matches who he is. But to Clarke, that's not freedom at all. It's like just reading lines from a script, even if it's a script for, ultimate goodness.
So to put it simply, one is saying freedom's doing what you're meant to do, and the other is saying it's about having the power to break away from that, to do something different, even if you never actually would.
Yeah, you got it. And this leads to a really interesting question that the Stanford piece doesn't explicitly answer, but it's kind of lurking there under the surface. Is there a type of freedom, a deeper kind, that goes beyond this whole back and forth? A freedom that isn't just about choosing between options, but something, I don't know, something more foundational?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this. What kind of deeper freedom are we talking about here?
Well, think back to some of those ideas we talked about earlier. The idea that maybe God didn't just choose between different possible worlds, but that he, like, created the entire framework of reality.
Right, that mind-blowing idea. God created the very possibility of choice, the whole idea of good and evil, all of it.
That's it. And if that's the case, then maybe his freedom isn't just about picking and choosing between pre-existing options. Maybe it's about something much bigger, much grander. The freedom to create, to bring something totally new into existence.
Okay, now that's making my brain hurt, but in a good way. So, are we saying God's freedom isn't limited by choosing good over evil? Because those are terms he basically defined himself. Like, he built the playground where those choices even happen.
Exactly. It's a freedom that kind of transcends, I don't know, our typical human way of thinking about choice. Because, it's happening on a whole other level.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So it's like, instead of God just picking between, chocolate or vanilla ice cream, he created the whole idea of ice cream itself.
Exactly. And that act of creation, that ultimate expression of like pure agency, that might be the most real, the most raw form of divine freedom we can even imagine.
Wow, that really flips the whole conversation on its head, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's not about whether God could have done something different within the rules he created. It's about the freedom he had in creating those rules in the first place.
That's it. And it leaves us with one final really big question to ponder. If this act of creation, if that's where we see God's ultimate freedom, what does that mean for our freedom, as humans.
Oh man, that's a heavy one. Are we just like these tiny reflections of God's creative power? Or do we have a totally different kind of freedom altogether?
That's a question worth really wrestling with. And honestly, I don't think it's one we can answer just by, sitting around thinking about it. Maybe it's something we discover by living our lives, by expressing our own creativity, by making choices, and, I don't know, making our mark on the world.
It's like that famous quote, right? We are condemned to be free. We have to make choices, whether we want to or not. And maybe that's where our own little spark of freedom comes in those moments when we decide who we are, what kind of difference we're going to make.
I love that. And maybe that's what we can take away from all this, from this whole deep dive into divine freedom. It's not just about God's choices. It's about recognizing the mystery and the responsibility of our own choices, too.
Well, there you have it, everyone. We've covered a lot of ground today, from Leibniz to Clarke to atoms and beyond. We've challenged some assumptions, stretched our imaginations a bit, and hopefully we've all come away with a deeper understanding of just how complex, how fascinating this whole idea of divine freedom really is.
And as always, this is just the beginning, right? That Stanford Encyclopedia article is a gold mine of information, so I really encourage you to keep digging, keep asking those big questions, and keep those philosophical fires burning.